morning. It's great to be here. So when Andres and I first started talking about what the topic today should be, he mentioned, okay, innovation, and innovation from a practitioner's standpoint. Because Polymath Ventures, which is the company I founded and lead right now, we are a company builder, and over the last 5 years, we've built 7 companies and raised $60 million. So we've had our share of successes, failures, and works in progress. At Polymath, we have built methodologies and culture to sustain that culture of challenge and being radical. And today, what I want to do is spend time to share with you our lessons and our point of view. What is the first company that comes to mind when you think of the word innovation? Okay. So many people said Apple. I bet that was probably what came to mind for about half the room at least. So despite the many decades that it's been on the world scene, Apple was still named #1 in the world in terms of being the most innovative company, at least according to Fast Company, this year in 2018. And what makes it innovative? What do we think about? What do we think their innovation is? So a lot of times we're thinking about their products, right? The design, the technology. And actually, if we go back, the PowerBook G4, that was the predecessor to the MacBooks, that was released in 2001. The iPod was released also in 2001. The iPhone, which we're all very familiar with and has changed all of our lives, was released in 2007. The iPad in 2010. What does this tell us? Today, all of these products account for 80% of Apple's revenues in the last year. So they're still dominant. They're what Apple makes money off of. And all of these products were introduced 8 to 17 years ago. And they have had only incremental, what I would call incremental, adjustments and updates on a yearly basis since then. Apple is known for their product innovations. And because Apple is sometimes synonymous with innovation, we often associate or equivocate innovation with product innovation. But we forget about the massive business model innovations that actually Apple pioneered. So if we go back to this timeline, in 2001, 2 amazing things happened. The iTunes Store was actually released, and the first Apple retail store was introduced. And later on in 2008, about a year after the iPhone was introduced, the App Store, which is kind of the evolution of the iTunes Store, was also launched. So if we go in and look at this, iTunes really transforms people's behaviors in terms of paying for digital content. That's when that started, right? And the App Store, which came after, really built the content and engagement ecosystem around the iPhone and the iPad. There's a lot of reasons why similar devices, I mean, you can talk about the touch interface and so forth, but actually there's a lot of other reasons around content why previous attempts at tablets and at smartphones didn't work out so well. And if we think about the Apple Store, the own stores allowed Apple to control the brand, control the channel, and control the user experience. And today, in the US at least, Apple sells half its computers, 40% of its iPads, and 20% of its phones through that channel. And this is in the US where the telecom operators are the dominant channel for phones to be sold. So, and actually, thinking from 2001 until now, this wave of direct-to-consumer companies that we see continuously today, actually Apple and Dell were the innovators of the direct-to-consumer model. From our perspective, radical and sustainable innovation usually require business model innovation. So that was a provocation for today. And a lot of companies that really transform their industries transform it through business model innovation. Uber, in terms of this, and especially UberX, in terms of the supply, changing private vehicles into public use vehicles. Spotify, changing how people's ownership relationship with music and digital content. Airbnb, in terms of the supply of temporary housing. TransferWise, in terms of how international transfers are actually made. And Warby Parker, in terms of really questioning why these sunglasses and eyeglass frames need to be that expensive when it's just made out of plastic, right? These are all business model innovations, but people usually think of them as technology companies. And there's actually very good examples of companies who are considered very innovative, and in truth, they were or are very innovative, but they were not business model innovations. And of course, there's always exceptions to the rule, but many of them do not function as well or are not as sustainable as standalone businesses. So Zappos, very famous, right? So Zappos was not a business model innovation. Almost every new company created when Zappos was created was an e-commerce company. Zappos' innovation was in customer service. And they did very well because of that. They were able to sell a product that couldn't be sold very well via e-commerce because they had such great customer service. But today, if it was a standalone company and it had not been bought by Amazon, I at least question how well it would be doing as a standalone company. GoPro totally defined the sporting camera category, right? But it's facing very strong competition today from smartphones, from Chinese copycats, and it has failed in its attempt to diversify into drones. So today its market cap is about 1/4 of when it was listed only in 2014. Twitter, very important, right? Shaping the world. But from a business perspective, it has continued to fail to find a scalable revenue, and it's never turned a profit. Business model innovation is incredibly important to be able to sustain these businesses as standalone businesses. So business model innovations, I'm going to give an attempt to define what they are and are not. They're usually painkillers rather than vitamins. So you're solving for a deep need. You're not solving for an incremental improvement in the product or service, right? Otherwise, you don't need the business model innovation. It's radical rather than incremental. So it's not about a pricing change, and it's not about just improvement of something. It's about radically changing it, maybe even breaking the system. It's systemic rather than targeted. So usually, to change a business model, you need to go back into the system map of the business and change how value is created and change how value is distributed and how value is charged for. So, just targeting or only attempting to change a very small piece of the system usually doesn't work, right? You need to think about all of the follow-on effects of that. It's about alliances rather than total ownership. So the last century of business strategy has been about integration, vertical and horizontal integration. So a lot of times we think that if we own the entire system, that's better, right? And a lot of in many markets where there's more oligopolies or monopolies, this is even more the perspective from the business community. But actually, I think a lot of the innovation has been around what are the right alliances to make? What are the right assets to leverage that you don't necessarily own? So you own important touch points, but you don't necessarily own the entire system. It's about openness rather than closed system. And this is the scary word. It's cannibalistic rather than additive. So a lot of business model innovation replaces the previous service or business, right? And maybe the market even shrinks. So you can find exceptions to these, but at least from a provocation standpoint, I think these 5 are very important, and often business model innovation businesses satisfy many of these. And why are these important? Why are these dimensions important, and why is business model innovation important? So if we go down these 5 criteria, from a painkiller perspective, often you are able to serve previously unserved demographics. So Grameen Bank is a good example. Aflore, which is a Polymath business, which I'll talk about a bit more later, is a good example of this. And when you're actually serving a deep need, you end up generating significant customer loyalty. And then from a scalability perspective, if you're able to offer a price-quality value proposition significantly better than what exists in the market, your speed to scale is going to be very different. Systemic, I think that's easy to explain. So it's much more defensible if you own more of the critical touch points of the system, right? Somebody like Apple tends to actually own those parts of the system, whereas other people like Uber and Airbnb, they are owning the touch points. Alliances is interesting. There's a couple ways to think about it. So one is that you're leveraging others' assets. Airbnb is a very good example of that. That allows you to scale quickly. But on the other hand, if you look at traditional businesses like GM, it's about hedging because it's very difficult to win all battles when there's so much disruption happening, in this case of GM, around the mobility space. So it's very hard to win the sharing battle, plus the electrification battle, plus the autonomous vehicle battle. So what you see them doing is investing or partnering across different dimensions. GM is invested in both the Uber Alliance and the anti-Uber Alliance. So you see them hedging a lot, and that's a very smart strategy. Cannibalistic, so business model innovation is important because it actually poses existential threats to incumbents. Uber in terms of the taxi industry, but also UberX for Uber, right? So once these lower cost vehicles came into play, then the luxury cars had a much smaller market. So at Polymath, we believe that business model innovation is built on these 3 things. One is deep insight. Second one is agile execution, and the third being integrated data and technology. It's important to think about how this affects the system of the business. So deep insight is a type of insight that can last a company 10 years, right? And it usually combines human insight and industry insight. So a little bit of history on this whole ride-sharing disruption, right? It started back in 2007, and the old model was around long-distance ride-sharing. And Lyft's old company was called Zimrides. An interesting aside there, Zimrides was inspired by the founder being in Zimbabwe and seeing minivan taxis being shared, right? So this is an interesting, from a developing world perspective, resource constrained, what are the innovations, and bringing it to the developed world. And it really leveraged the Facebook API that just opened up, so you could actually do long-distance ride-sharing with trust rather than finding a random person on Craigslist. And because they wanted more daily user engagement, they ended up switching to Lyft, which was a short-distance ride-sharing with trust. Around the same time, this company was created called UberCab. And the original business model of UberCab was that it was about a mobile app sharing the cost of black cars with other riders, right? And the insight there was really that San Francisco had too few taxis. San Francisco has something like 1,200 taxi medallions, which is very, very low for the size of the city that it is. And the enabler was the ubiquitous mobile internet. So eventually what it evolved to is the mobility platforms that we know now. But the deep insight is actually that there's an excess or a latent supply of cars and drivers willing to drive, especially in developed markets. So I I believe that the deep insight for Uber is not technology. It's actually around the human insights around the driver and the industry insights around the excess supply of cars. At Polymath, we believe that deep insight can be systematically uncovered. And this is what the Polymath 3-month seed venture design process does. We start with a month of research. We go and synthesize the deep learnings we had through the ethnographic research into insights and opportunities. We go through a period where we ideate, so we go up to 600 to 700 ideas, and then we contract it back down to a handful, so that very extreme expansionary and contractionary process is very important. And then we build prototypes that mimic, that create realistic user experiences, and we test and iterate. And very importantly, that early part of the process is not so different than what design firms do, but I think one of the things that we've incorporated very well is actually iterating the prototypes in the actual business model and really understanding what are the key variables of innovation and testing those in an iterative manner. So some of you guys know about Aflore, but for those that don't, I think Aflore is a very good example of how we used this process to uncover the deep need. So in the beginning, when we were interviewing extreme users, we usually interview extreme users because they're more insightful about why they do something. We unintentionally found our first informal advisor, or what we call consejeros. And her name was Zunilda. She was a hairdresser, and she owned 2 apartments that she rented out. She actually had mortgages on the 2 apartments that she rented out for income, and she was in the middle of the process of buying a bus, again, for income. And she was, this is a hairdresser's income, but she was the financial role model in her workplace and in her community. And even when we were there interviewing her, we saw the dynamic of people coming to her to ask her things. So this is just one of the early insights that inspired us. As we synthesized the information, we came up with 8 insights and 8 opportunity areas, and one of them was directly related to the power of informal financial services, in particular people like Zunilda. So at the time, the opportunity area was phrased as human touch, give a familiar human face to financial institutions. And we ended up coming up with many ideas and contracted it down to 8 business concepts. And number 5 on the list was empowering informal advisors. The original idea was actually to give these consejeros bank products for them to sell and make additional income. But then what we realized was that people not only needed a new channel that they trusted, they also needed financial products that suited their lives, that were flexible for and adapted to their lives. And we had some other concepts that were product concepts, so we combined it as we were prototyping. And today, Aflore is a direct sales network for financial services. The consejeros are the bedrock of the company because they provide engagement, they have privileged information about the clients that would be impossible or incredibly expensive for banks to actually get. And they create the social pressure for collections because these are people that are your role models. It's the last person you want to disappoint in your daily life. And today, so if you really think about it, Aflore's deep insight is that there are underutilized trust and information resources, in this case consejeros, in the Latin American middle class that can massively reduce the cost of originating and servicing a loan to this demographic. That's the deep insight. That's the insight that's going to last the company at least 10 years, even if we change our business models, change the way we communicate, change the technology tools that we use to assess credit, communicate, and so forth. And today, Aflore manages 12,000 consejeros in Bogota and Medellin. We have a very healthy credit risk, and we are operating at a fraction of the cost of microfinance. and we're just getting started. So in a highly ambiguous environment, agile execution is incredibly important. It emphasizes speed, so we need to be fast, we need to be iterative, and be resource constrained. So this is one of the resource constraint is one of the big lessons even at Polymath. So we've actually progressively raised more money, and we are in the process of not increasing the amount of money we invest in our ventures, but decreasing it. So speed of learning is the first aspect. So a lot of times people talk about speed, but they don't really talk about speed of learning. And that's really the only advantage you have as a startup. So we are pretty religious about our weekly sprints, right? That is, everything needs to be done with a weekly perspective. And so I think there's a lot of management systems that we put in place to ensure that speed of learning. Lean MVP is a redundancy. MVP's minimum viable products should be lean, but we put lean MVP just to overemphasize that point. We purposely design low fidelity tests, so low resolution tests, products that are, look pretty crappy, right? And that's intentional because if somebody buys with that low fidelity, it means you're really solving a problem that they're not able to solve, right? So that prioritizes this painkiller criteria of business model innovation we were talking about before. And we talk a lot about the staircase of tests. So the staircase allows us to test more and more, a sequence of business model variables, right? Instead of jumping from one test to all of a sudden launching the full-blown product. And hypothesis gates. So we design very frequent stingy decision gates. And stingy being, we don't release the funds until that gate is met. And those gates need to be aligned, not just with time, but with, did you prove? So if you're doing business model innovation, you should know what are the variables you're innovating on. And so did you really prove those variables? And then you moved on to the next gate. The staircase is designing the test from low to high fidelity. And this is actually one of the mistakes that both, I think, large companies and small companies make. So often people talk themselves into saying, hey, if we do this low fidelity test, what if it's a false negative? What if the product's not good enough and that's why people don't buy? Instead of saying, okay, if they buy a not very good product, it means you're in the right direction of solving a deep pain, right? So people do that often, and we've done it, because they're afraid to fail. And actually, it's a trap, because premature high-fidelity tests has a high chance of not working because you don't really know what the product looks like. And then you get into a commitment bias because it's then usually very expensive to iterate or to pivot, right? And by that point, you spent all of your resources putting on the high fidelity test, whether it's in time or resources or money, and now you have very little runway to change. And you can see very clearly how startups can make this mistake, but also corporations, because corporations are saying, hey, I don't want to launch this thing because it might impact my brand, or it doesn't, pass certain criteria we have internally, and this is a huge barrier. In a ton of detail, but at a flow day, partly because we were so resource constrained, we did a very, very methodical staircase. So we started with paper prototypes. The first MVP, the first loans we gave out, was walking around Bogota and asking a neighborhood, hey, do you know anybody of this profile? And everybody pointed to Yaneth, who was a tailor, and we gave 3 loans. That was like a 2-week test of a flow day, right? And we progressively tested other important business model variables about creating a new channel, like the cost of acquisition. Was there a principal agent issue, transforming informal financial services to formal financial services, and what was the level of engagement of that channel. So very methodical. Kidu is a company that we had, which was in after-school education. The paper prototypes were super successful. I mean, when you went to speak to middle-class moms about it, everybody would cry and say, I need it now. And then we talked ourselves into investing significant time and capital to actually build the first site, because we said, well, there's after-school programs already. What are we going to learn by just putting on another one? The whole thing is about this being under one roof, the aspirational component and offering a high-quality after-school education program. But we then locked ourselves into the site business model before we really understood that well enough. And then we started to scale, which means we had actually pretty good sales in the early days. And so we said, oh, now we are just ready to make this site profitable. So we worked on utilization, and we worked on unit economics instead of doing lean experimentation to really understand product market fit. So even in our world at Polymath, where we're obsessed about lean, we don't have a lot of money, and so forth, it's quite easy to talk yourself into high-fidelity tests because you're afraid of a false negative. Technology is incredibly important, but how is it important, right? So many people believe that technology companies are necessarily driven by cutting-edge technology insight. So this is true, obviously, in the case of internal combustion engines, wireless technology, semiconductors. But many of the most iconic tech companies today are actually built on human and industry insight and are technology-enabled. So let's take 3 examples: Uber, Spotify, and TransferWise, and go through each of them. So for Uber, the human industry insight, like I mentioned before, is the excess supply of cars, especially private cars, that people only drove their private cars a couple hours a day, and the rest of the time was idle. This is especially in the case of UberX, right? And there is a sufficient supply of drivers willing to work part-time or full-time. And that from the user perspective, there is a willingness to decrease car ownership if the sharing experience doesn't have too much friction. So those are the human industry insights. And the technology enabler was the fact of ubiquitous adoption of smartphones and mobile internet. That's the enabler, right? For Spotify, the human industry insight is that access to music is much more important than ownership. So if I have continuous access whenever I want, I don't really care if I own it, right? And sharing, and the fact that the sharing and discovery of music was very, very important to the music experience. So what was the technology enabler? It's actually the ubiquitous availability of broadband and Wi-Fi. And for TransferWise, in the fintech world, right, the human insight is that many people's financial lives are now cross-border, but banks are very tied to the country borders, and that a global ledger and exchange system allowed these international transactions, or previously international transactions, to become local ones because you could cancel out the money that needed to be transferred across borders. And the technology enabler is the fact that all the banks had built online banking. There was banking APIs, and for that connection, all those connections across different countries to actually happen. An industry and company's understanding of technology generally evolves in 4 stages. And over time, it leads to this integrated technology and data that enables the sustainability of the business model innovation, right? So in the beginning, usually people's understanding of technology is just mimicking the analog solution, right? So like, instead of calling for pizza, now I can order it on the web or use an application. But you're just mimicking the behavior you had in the analog world. And then you have, the next step is really understanding, okay, what are the true advantages and capabilities of the technology? It can radically change how much you can standardize, how much efficiency you can get out of it, and scalability. So Domino's pizza is a technology company or it's a pizza, fast food pizza chain. It's getting to be more a technology company because they're not just saying, hey, you can order on the Domino's app. They're actually putting technology across the entire operating process in order to guarantee that the pizza can be there in 30 minutes. Right? So that's truly understanding technology capabilities. Usually in the beginning of that happening, it's very cumbersome. So technology takes center stage, but it's not very adapted to the human behavior. And then the next step is actually adapting the technology to the human behavior to make it seamless or almost invisible. So to the user, they don't really care that Domino's has invested all this money into the supply chain and into all the ways they measure every step of the pizza making process. They just care that the pizza gets there in 30 minutes. And the last is around data ownership. So really understanding how the collection and use of that proprietary data, making all of your business decisions based on it, that's kind of the next step afterwards. So my contention is that a lot of times we are confusing, where's the insight? Is the insight a technology insight that starts the business, or is the insight a human and industry insight? And I think the other piece is, I think that many people are not very thoughtful about what part of understanding the importance and integrating data and technology is into their business model innovation. And the last thing I will say is that innovation cannot happen without the right team and culture, period, right? So you can do everything right that we've talked about before, but it's just impossible to make it happen without the right people, the right composition people, and the right culture. And very quickly, in the Polymath world at least, we understand, this is very synthesized, but we understand it along these 4 dimensions. So one is about diversity. It's very hard to innovate when you have a bunch of people that went to the same school, that work at the same company, and had the same mentor. Right? So you need to combine different disciplines and different backgrounds, different way of thinking, different personalities. Then it's about beginner's mindset. So creating culture that people are allowed to challenge everything. They're allowed to ask stupid questions and not be judged, and putting the non-expert view at the center. So most corporations have a really hard time at that because their entire existence is built on we are the experts. We've been doing it for 30 years, 50 years, 80 years, and that's why we continue to be market leaders. So it's very difficult to say, let's take the non-expert view. Let's allow somebody who doesn't know anything about the space to come here and ask me all these questions over and over and over again. They get to make the decision. Growth mindset. So a lot of bad decisions are made because people are afraid to fail. And innovation requires failure. Innovation requires the openness to fail. And so being open to failing and learning, both as a person and as a business, is necessary. And it's necessary almost to an extreme degree. And the last one is founder's mindset. So you can't innovate if you're just a consultant. It's just very, very hard. So because then you're not responsible for what happens after. You're not responsible for all the bad decisions you make, right? And so the risk-reward system and the culture needs to incentivize ownership. So I have a lot of conversations with larger companies that want to innovate, and they put in a director of innovation, and they think that that is like a good first step. I think the good first step is to actually figure out what is the risk-reward system so that there can be a real ownership mindset in any project of innovation. The last thing I'll say, I know I said that before, but the last thing I will say today is how do we bridge today with the future? So we believe at Polymath that deep insight is incredibly important, but it probably only wins the battle in the next few years. So data ownership and building a powerful ecosystem, right, which is the alliances that you do, what are the things you're leveraging, how do you think about even reaching out to other industries, because industries are collapsing onto each other right now. Out of the 120 industries out there, McKinsey's point of view is that there will probably be a dozen ecosystems left at the end. So the data ownership and the ecosystem building is probably going to win the battle in the next 5 to 15 years. So thank you so much.